The old courthouse books were not supposed to be read. Piled up in a forgotten basement of the old Richmond County building, these leather-covered books had made it through fires, floods, and many years of being ignored on purpose. When the Preservation Society started to copy historical papers to computers in 2009, an intern named Rebecca Chen saw something strange in a Plantation sale record from 1847. The same woman's name showed up 5 times for 5 different properties in only 7 years. Each entry had a note with it that made the historian stop and get her boss. With newborn child, this finding would uncover one of the most upsetting patterns ever written down in property records before the Civil War. 5 plantations, 5 births, 5 sales, all in 7 years, all with the same woman. The exact math of it was scary, and what it meant was even worse. But to know what those books truly showed, what they wrote down in cold numbers and plain language, we have to go back to the beginning. To a woman whose story was not in diaries or letters, but in sales slips, birth records, and the cruel math of buying and selling people. Before we go on with the story of Martha and the 5 plantations that were like her prisons, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you always see stories like this one. And tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. Let's find out together what these records showed. What the Preservation Society discovered was not just one woman's sad story. It was proof of a system, a pattern, a machine of abuse so organized that it left behind a paper trail that no one thought would ever be looked at. Martha got to Riverside Plantation on a damp Tuesday morning in April 1840. She was 19 years old, bought at an auction in Charleston for $800, a large amount of money that showed not just that she was young and healthy, but something more precious and risky. She could read and write, and it was on record. The bill of sale, kept in the Charleston City records, listed her abilities: reading, writing, math, sewing, cooking. At a time when teaching enslaved people to read was against the law in many southern states, the fact that Martha could read made her both valuable and a threat at the same time. The auction was in a brick warehouse near the docks, where the smell of salt water mixed with sweat and fear. Martha had stood on a wooden stage while men in nice coats looked at her teeth, her hands, and the way she stood. They told her to read parts of the Charleston newspaper. She did it, her voice calm, her eyes on the words and not on the faces looking at her. When the bidding got to $800, William Hargrove lifted his hand one last time, and Martha belonged to him. Riverside was a huge place, spread over 200 acres of rich land along the Savannah River, just north of the Georgia line. The main house was a 3-story Georgian-style building with white pillars that you could see from the river. It was a sign of wealth and power that anyone going by could see. Behind the house, rows of cotton fields went on toward the pine forests that showed where the property ended. Closer to the main house were the other buildings: a kitchen house, a laundry house, storehouses, stables, and a row of small cabins where the enslaved workers lived. William Hargrove had gotten Riverside from his father in 1837. Along with 63 enslaved people and a lot of debt. At 32, he was set on making the plantation profitable again using what he called modern ways of managing. He kept very detailed books, writing down every bale of cotton, every pound of seed, every dollar spent and made. He also kept detailed records of the people he owned: names, ages, skills, purchases, sales, births, and deaths, all written in neat columns of black ink. Riverside's book recorded Martha's arrival with just a few words: April 14th, 1840. Martha, female, age 19, bought at Charleston auction, cost $800, skills, can read, housework, sent to main house under the watch of Mrs. Hargrove. The main house staff had 9 people: a cook, 2 kitchen helpers, 3 house servants, 2 laundry workers, and a stable boy who also worked in the garden. Martha was told to work directly under Eleanora Hargrove, William's wife, a thin woman of 30 with lips that were always tight and a name for being strictly religious and harsh. Mrs. Hargrove ran the house like an army, demanding total silence during meals, that all orders be followed instantly, and that everyone show they were thankful for the Christian kindness of being given a home, food, and clothes. Martha's day started before the sun came up. She got up in the dark before sunrise, put on the coarse cotton dress and apron that was her uniform, and rushed to the main house to start fires in the bedrooms and parlor. By the time the Hargrove family woke up, the house had to be warm, water had to be heated, and breakfast had to be getting ready. Her mornings were for cleaning bedrooms, making beds with tight corners that Mrs. Hargrove would check with a ruler, dusting furniture and shining silver. Afternoons were for laundry, heating water, scrubbing clothes on washboards, hanging everything to dry, and ironing with heavy flat irons heated on the stove. Evenings were for serving dinner, cleaning the dining room and kitchen, and getting the house ready for the night. She was almost never done before 9 or 10 at night, and then she had to walk back to her cabin in the living quarters, tired, to fall onto her straw bed until it all started again before dawn. The work never stopped, but Martha put up with it. She had learned how to survive when she was young. Don't look them straight in the eye, but don't look like you're fighting back. Move fast, but not in a panic. Talk only when someone talks to you first. Figure out what they need before they say it. Become invisible unless you are needed. She didn't make friends with the other house servants at first, knowing that getting close meant being weak. She watched, learned the daily routines of the house, and tried to be as useful and as unnoticeable as she could. The other house servants slowly started to get used to her. There was Dinah, the head cook, a woman in her 50s, whose talent with fancy meals had made Riverside well known among the local plantation owners. There was Esther, 23, who worked in the kitchen and had 2 little children in the quarters. There was Clara, 16, jumpy and fast, who was sent to do laundry after being too clumsy to serve food at the table. These women spoke to Martha in short bits, a warning about Mrs. Hargrove's moods, advice on which jobs to do first, and small signs of support that could not be said out loud, but were understood anyway. 3 months after Martha arrived, in July, a new overseer came to Riverside. His name was Dutch Carmichael, a 35-year-old man with reddish hair and a face that was rough from years of working outside. Hargrove had hired him from a plantation in South Carolina, drawn in by Carmichael's name for getting more work done and keeping order. Carmichael moved into the overseer's house, a small cottage near the stables, and started using new rules: earlier work start times, shorter meal breaks, stricter counting of picked cotton, and quick punishment for any sign of laziness. Within days, Carmichael started giving Martha strange attention. It began in small ways. He would show up near the kitchen house when Martha was getting water. He would watch her hang laundry, standing just where she could see him out of the corner of her eye. He began making up reasons to call her for jobs, taking messages to workers in the fields, checking supplies in storage buildings, jobs that took her away from the main house and the watching eyes of the other servants. The other women saw it right away. Dinah tried to keep Martha near the kitchen. Esther warned her with her eyes when Carmichael came near. Clara whispered to her one evening, "Don't go anywhere by yourself. Stay where people can see you." But there was no place that was truly safe, no one to go to for help, no protection from any law. An enslaved woman had no legal power to say no to any order from any white person, and everyone knew it. In early August, Carmichael trapped Martha in the laundry house. It was late afternoon, and the sun shining through the windows made sharp shadows. The other laundry workers had gone to get dinner ready. Martha was folding sheets when she heard the door shut and knew she wasn't alone anymore. What took place in the laundry house that day was never written down in any book or paper. Martha never told anyone about it, but the pattern it started would follow her through 5 plantations and 7 years. By October, Martha knew she was pregnant. She told no one, wrapping her middle tightly with strips of cloth to hide the changes. She kept working, going through her days with the same quiet skill, while fear and anger fought inside her. She knew what being pregnant meant. She had seen it happen before, had heard the quiet stories among enslaved women, about children being born and sold away, about mothers being taken from their babies, about how especially unsafe it was to have a child whose father was a white man. By January 1841, hiding it was not possible. Her body gave her away even with the wrappings. Mrs. Hargrove saw it during a fitting for new house uniforms. Her thin fingers suddenly grabbed Martha's arm with surprising force. "You're with child," Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice without emotion. It was a statement. Martha said nothing. What was there to say? That night, Mrs. Hargrove told her husband about it in his study. William Hargrove listened, his face showing no feeling, and then called for Dutch Carmichael. The talk in Hargrove's study went on for 17 minutes. The house servants working in the next rooms heard loud voices but couldn't understand the words. Carmichael came out with his face red, his jaw tight, and walked straight to the overseer's cottage without a word to anyone. 3 days later, Carmichael was fired from Riverside. The book noted, Jan 19, 1841, fired Dutch Carmichael, overseer, for breaking the house rules, paid final wages of $47. That same day, Martha was moved from the main house to a cabin at the very end of the quarters, as far from the main house as she could be, and still be on the plantation. It was a small cabin that had been used for storage, with a dirt floor, one window, and a fireplace that let out a lot of smoke. She was given a straw mattress, 2 blankets, and was told to stay there until after the baby was born. For the next 4 months, Martha lived almost completely alone. Esther brought her food twice a day, cornbread, buttermilk, and sometimes a little bit of salt pork or greens. She was not allowed to go to the evening prayer meetings or the few Sunday get-togethers. She was not given any work. She lived in a strange in-between state, not really part of the plantation community, but not totally away from it either. Being alone gave Martha time to think, to be sad, and to get ready. She thought about her own mother, who was sold when Martha was 7. She thought about the future growing inside her, a child she did not choose but would love anyway. She thought about running away. The woods were close, and she knew stories of people who had run to the north. But she also knew the truth, hunting dogs, slave patrols, and the terrible punishments for those caught trying to run away. On May 3rd, 1841, Martha started giving birth. An old enslaved woman named Aunt Sarah, who was the midwife for the plantation, helped her. The labor went on for 14 hours. In the cabin with no windows, lit only by 1 candle and the fireplace, Martha gave birth to her daughter as spring rain hit the roof. The plantation birth record, kept in the Riverside book, said, May 3rd, 1841. Baby girl born to Martha, a house servant. Child is healthy, weighs about 7 pounds. Mother has recovered from birth. Father unknown. Martha named her daughter Sarah, after the midwife who had been with her through the long night. The name was never put in any official record. For 6 special weeks, Martha stayed in the cabin with her daughter. She held Sarah, fed her, sang to her in soft whispers, and memorized every little part of her tiny face. These were the only 6 weeks in Sarah's life when she would have her mother's full attention, when Martha could just be her mother without the heavy weight of slavery deciding every moment. Then, on a humid morning in late June, William Hargrove came to Martha's cabin with a man she had never seen before. The man wore a nice coat, even though it was hot, and carried a leather bag full of papers. This was Vernon Hughes, a slave trader who worked between Charleston and Augusta. He bought and sold people with the same easy manner as someone trading farm animals. They stood outside the cabin for a few minutes. Martha, inside with Sarah, could see them through the window. Hargrove was pointing, Hughes was looking at papers, nodding, and sometimes looking toward the cabin door. The sale was being finished just feet away from Martha, as if she was not a person with her own thoughts and feelings, but just an item being passed from one owner to another. Finally, Hargrove knocked on the cabin door. Martha opened it, holding Sarah tight. "Martha," Hargrove said, his voice all business, "you and the child have been sold. Mr. Hughes here will take you to a new place. You have 30 minutes to get your things." The Plantation book recorded June 28, 1008, 141. Sale of Martha, age 20, and baby daughter to Hughes Trading Company, Charleston. Sale price $750. Reason for sale, being moved for discipline. Money used for the estate's running costs. Martha got exactly 30 minutes. She wrapped Sarah in the cleanest cloth she owned, got her few things, a comb, an extra dress, a small wooden cross Esther had secretly given her, and walked out of the cabin. Esther and Dinah stood far off, not talking, not coming closer, but watching. Their faces showed what their voices could not say. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, God be with you." Martha got into the back of Vernon Hughes's wagon. 3 other enslaved people were already in there. 2 men and a woman, all looking shocked, all just bought from nearby properties. The wagon left Riverside, its wheels making a crunching sound on the gravel path. Martha looked back one time at the plantation that was her home for 14 months. She saw the white pillars of the main house shining in the morning sun. She saw the fields where men and women were already working in the cotton. She saw the quarters where she had lived for the first few months, and the lonely cabin where she had given birth. She would not see Riverside again, but in a horrible way, she would never really leave it. What happened there, the attention, the violence, the pregnancy, the birth, the sale, would become the pattern that would shape the next 7 years of her life. As the wagon bounced northward, Sarah slept in Martha's arms, not knowing that her birth had just made her mother lose everything, not knowing that they were both about to become parts of a cruel game that would be played across 5 plantations in 4 states. This was just the start of Martha's journey. The first plantation had started the pattern. 4 more were waiting for her, each one following the same awful script. The courthouse books would write down every sale perfectly, but they would never write down the cost to the people involved. The wagon trip from Riverside to Fairmont Estate took 3 days and went almost 90 miles through the pine forests and red clay hills of Georgia. Vernon Hughes was a man who worked on a strict schedule and for small profits. He stopped only when he had to, for short breaks to give the horses water, quick buys of cornbread and salted meat for the people he was carrying, and overnight stops at inns where the enslaved people were locked in sheds while Hughes slept in a bed. Martha found out on this trip that she and the others were not being taken to a certain buyer. They were like goods in a store. Hughes would stop at Plantations on his way, show his merchandise to possible buyers, discuss prices, and make sales when he could. It was a terrible kind of math. Hughes had bought Martha and Sarah for $750 from Hargrove, and he had to sell them for more than that to make money. Every day of food and a place to stay cut into his profits. On the 3rd day, Hughes's wagon went up a long driveway lined with oak trees toward a large house. This was Fairmont Estate. a tobacco plantation in central Georgia owned by two brothers, Charles and Edmund Beaumont. The property had been in the Beaumont family for 2 generations, but recent bad harvests and lower tobacco prices had made them run it with fewer workers and less money than their father had. Hughes had a meeting set up with Charles Beaumont, who had told a local trader that he wanted to buy a female servant who could read. When the wagon showed up, Charles Beaumont came out of the house. He was a heavy man of 50 with thinning hair and a look of constant worry. His younger brother, Edmund, came from the tobacco barn, wiping his hands on his pants. The price talk happened in the front yard of the main house, with Martha standing close by, holding 8 week-old Sarah. Hughes showed Martha's papers, proof of purchase from Riverside, a note about her being able to read and do housework, and promises of her good health and behavior. Charles Beaumont told Martha to read out loud from a paper for tobacco buyers. She did, her voice calm, even though she was tired from 3 days of travel. The price discussion took 20 minutes. Hughes wanted $850, $100 profit. Charles said that a woman with a baby was worth less than a single woman, that the child would cost money for years before being old enough to work, that times were hard, and he couldn't spend a lot. They agreed on $650. The Fairmont book recorded Martha's arrival, July 2nd, 1841. Bought one female Negro, Martha, age 20, with infant daughter, about 8 weeks old. Last owner, Riverside Plantation through Hughes Trading Co. Purchase price $650, skills noted, reading, writing, house service, job, fieldwork, tobacco growing, fieldwork. The 2 words felt like a punch to Martha. At Riverside, even with everything that happened, she had been house staff. It was hard work, for sure, but she was out of the worst weather and had slightly better food and clothes than the field workers. Field work meant working in groups, in the sun, under the overseer's whip, the terrible speed of planting and harvesting. And with a baby daughter to look after, Charles Beaumont saw Martha's face change and misunderstood it. "You'll do what you're told," he said in a sharp voice. "Being able to read doesn't get you out of honest work. You'll join the tobacco crews starting tomorrow morning." Fairmont was different from Riverside in almost every way. The plantation was smaller, with 600 acres being farmed, but nearly 80 enslaved people worked it. The quarters were more packed, with families squeezed into small cabins, sometimes 2 families in one room. The work was harder, the food was less, and the supervision was meaner. Martha was put in a cabin with 2 other women, Patience, a field worker in her 40s, who had lost 3 children to sale, and Ruth, a young woman of 22, with twin boys who were 4. The cabin was about 12 feet by 14 feet, with a dirt floor, 1 small window, and a fireplace that all 3 women used for cooking and heat. There was no privacy. It was hard to sleep. The twin boys cried at night. Sarah cried at different times, and all 3 women had to get up before sunrise for their jobs. Growing tobacco took different work than cotton. The plants needed care all the time. Moving small plants, picking tobacco worms off by hand, trimming the plants to help the leaves grow, picking them at just the right time, and hanging the leaves in drying barns where it could get as hot as 130 degrees. The work was detailed, the same thing over and over, and tiring. Martha worked with Sarah tied to her chest in a cloth sling, which made every move harder. When Sarah cried because she was hungry, Martha had to stop her work to feed her, which made the overseer angry. When it rained, there was no place to go for cover. The work kept going, with everyone wet to the bone. When the sun was hot, there was very little water and no shade. Martha learned to work while very tired, to ignore pain, and to keep moving because stopping meant punishment. Charles Beaumont was often not at Fairmont. He was busy with tobacco sales in Augusta and Savannah, with social events in the nearby town of Milledgeville, and with the constant money problems of keeping a struggling plantation going. The day-to-day running of the place was left to his younger brother Edmund, who lived in a small house on the property and acted as the overseer. Edmund Beaumont was 42 years old and had never married. He was a man with changing moods. Sometimes he was cheerful and easygoing, letting them have longer meal breaks and lighter work, and other times he was angry and cruel, suddenly getting mad over small mistakes. The enslaved workers learned to tell his moods by the way he walked, and if he had been drinking. When he walked with a relaxed confidence, the day would be okay. When he walked with a stiff purpose and smelled of whiskey, everyone was careful. Within 2 weeks of Martha's arrival, Edmund started to pay special attention to her. At first, it was supposedly about her being able to read. He would call her to the plantation office, a small building near the tobacco barn where they kept records and supplies, and have her read parts of farming journals and tobacco market reports out loud. He would sit at his desk following along, telling her to say phrases again, saying he needed help understanding the words. Martha quickly saw that Edmund could barely read himself. He could read simple things slowly, but anything complicated was a struggle for him. Her reading times became a regular thing, 3 or 4 times a week, always in the late afternoon or early evening, always after the day's work was over and most people had gone back to the quarters. The sessions started out fine, but slowly Edmund's attention turned more personal. He started asking Martha questions about her past, about Riverside, about how she learned to read. He began to say things about how she looked, saying that fieldwork was too hard for someone so refined. He began to touch her shoulder when he leaned over to point at a word, letting his hand stay there. Patience noticed when Martha came back from these sessions, her face showing no emotion. "That man is trouble," she said softly one evening as they made their small dinner. "Edmund's been this way as long as I've been here. You watch yourself." But there was no way to watch herself that would make a difference. Martha had no power to say no to Edmund's calls, no way to avoid being alone with him, no help if he decided to use the total power he had over her. She could only bear it the way she had learned to bear everything else. By late October, Edmund's plans had become clear. The reading sessions were just excuses for something else. Martha would come out of the office later and later, her jaw tight, her eyes looking far away. She didn't say anything to anyone because there was nothing to say. The other women understood without any words. By early December 1841, Martha knew she was pregnant again. The knowledge came with a feeling of being crushed by something she couldn't stop. She had only been at Fairmont for 5 months. Sarah was just 7 months old, and now another child was on the way, created through violence, and sure to make her life even more complicated in a system that saw children as both money, makers, and problems, depending on who their father was. This time, Martha did not try to hide the pregnancy. What was the use? By March 1842, when her condition was clear to everyone, she just kept working, her body hurting under the double weight of pregnancy and hard work. She worked in the tobacco fields until she was 8 months pregnant, until the overseer who watched the work group, Sedmond, had hired a man named Foster to directly manage the field work, finally moved her to easier work, like carrying water, cooking for the field groups, and cleaning the tobacco barn. In late May, Charles Beaumont came back from a long trip to Savannah. Within 2 days, he heard about Martha's pregnancy. The plantation was small enough that gossip spread fast, and this particular rumor, that Edmund had gotten the new literate servant pregnant, was too interesting to stay quiet. Charles confronted his brother in the main house. The servants working nearby heard their voices getting louder, heard Charles's anger, and Edmund's defensive replies. The argument went on for more than an hour, and finished with Charles storming out, and Edmund going into his cottage, where he stayed for 2 days. On June 12, 1842, Martha started giving birth. This time, Patience, who had experience with childbirth and helped the Plantations women, attended the birth. The labor was shorter than with Sarah, 9 hours, but it was harder. Martha was worn out from months of fieldwork while pregnant, not getting enough food from the small rations given to enslaved workers, and emotionally broken by the repeated trauma. When the baby, a boy, finally came just after midnight, Martha held him and cried. She cried for him, for Sarah, for herself, for the impossibility of their situation. She named him Daniel, a name that means God is my judge, even though she hardly believed in a God who would let such suffering happen. The Fairmont birth record said, June 12, 1842, male baby born to Martha, field worker, child healthy, weighs about 6 pounds, mother survived hard labor, father unknown. The word unknown was a legal lie everyone understood. Everyone knew who Daniel's father was, but saying it officially would cause problems, questions of inheritance, of social standing, of scandal. It was better to leave it officially unknown and deal with the problem in private. The problem was dealt with 6 weeks later. On August 1st, 1842, a slave trader named Foster arrived at Fairmont Estate. He was a younger man, maybe 30, who worked out of Augusta and specialized in fast sales, buying enslaved people for cheap and quickly reselling them for small profits. He came in the afternoon, talked with Charles Beaumont for an hour, and left with a bill of sale. The Fairmont Ledger recorded August 3rd, 1842, sale of Martha, age 21, and 2 infant children to Foster and Sons Trading, Augusta. Sale price $700. Reason, getting rid of unneeded estate burdens. Money used for running costs. Martha was given 1 hour to get ready. She got Sarah, now 15 months old, and Daniel, 7 weeks old, wrapped them both in what cloth she had, and prepared to leave. Patience helped her pack, moving without a word, her face wet with tears she didn't try to wipe away. You have strength. Patience whispered as they hugged goodbye. More strength than anyone should have to need. You remember that. You have strength, and these babies have you. Martha climbed into Foster's wagon with her 2 children. As they left Fairmont Estate, she saw Edmund Beaumont watching from the window of his cottage. His face showed no expression. She had been at Fairmont for 13 months. She was leaving with 2 children and a sale price that was $75 less than what she had been bought for just over a year ago. The pattern was becoming clear, even if Martha didn't fully understand what it meant yet. 2 plantations, 2 pregnancies, 2 sales, and 3 more plantations were still to come. Foster's area covered eastern Georgia and the western part of South Carolina, a route he traveled often, buying enslaved people from plantations that were not doing well and reselling them to richer ones. His business was based on selling a lot and selling fast, quick purchases, quick sales, and spending as little as possible on food and housing for the people he was selling. Martha and her children were with Foster for 2 weeks, first at his holding place in Augusta, a warehouse near the river where enslaved people waited to be sold, and then on a wagon trip north. During those 2 weeks, Martha saw the inner workings of the domestic slave trade up close. People came to the warehouse every day, handled like items, listed by age, sex, skills, and health. Families were regularly torn apart. Husbands were sold to one buyer, wives to another, children split among many buyers. The crying never stopped. The hopelessness was thick in the air, and the cruelty was casual. Martha kept Sarah and Daniel close to her every second, scared that Foster might decide it was better to sell them separately. A woman who could read might get a good price, and children could be sold for their future work potential. But Foster seemed to know that Martha's value was higher if the family stayed together. A whole ewe, it was easier to sell to certain kinds of buyers who liked to say they didn't break up families, at least not openly. On August 18th, 1842, Foster's wagon went into the rolling hills of northern Georgia, heading toward one of the largest and richest plantations in the area. Oakwood Plantation was on prime cotton-growing land. Its 200 acres were worked by nearly 200 enslaved people. The property was owned by the Prescott family, Robert Prescott, his wife Eleanor, and their 3 grown sons, Thomas, William, and James. The Prescott family was old money and old power. Robert Prescott's grandfather had gotten a land grant from the colony in the 1760s, and 3 generations had turned Oakwood into a cotton empire. They were respected in the area, known for being very religious, for going to the Presbyterian church regularly, for giving to local charities for white people, and for being known as good slaveholders. This meant they didn't often separate families, gave enough food and clothing, and punished mistakes with reasonable, rather than extreme cruelty. Foster had a regular business relationship with Robert Prescott, who sometimes bought enslaved workers to replace those who had died, gotten old, or been sold. When Foster's wagon arrived, Robert and his wife Eleanor came out to look at the people for sale. Eleanor Prescott was an impressive woman of 55, tall and with a straight back, who was very involved in running the household and keeping what she saw as Christian standards of how a plantation should be run. The talk about Martha's price was mostly between Foster and Robert Prescott, though Eleanor often chimed in. Foster showed Martha's papers, pointing out her ability to read and her past experience in house service, and downplaying the fieldwork at Fairmont. Robert was interested in her literacy but worried about the 2 young children. "She'll be busy taking care of infants," Robert noted. "Her work will be limited for years." Foster lowered his price to $625 for all 3. Eleanor Prescott looked at Martha directly, asking her to read from the Bible, testing her handwriting on a slate, and asking about her experience with running a household. Martha answered cautiously, trying to seem capable and obedient, knowing her life and her children's lives might hang on this performance. The sale was made. The Oakwood records show August 18th, 1842. Purchase of 1 female Martha, age 21, with 2 infant children, female approx. 15 months, male approx. 8 weeks. Previous owner, Foster and Sons Trading via Fairmont Estate. Purchase price $625. Skills, literate household service. Assignment, spinning house, general household support. Oakwood was different from any place Martha had known. The size of it was huge. 200 people lived in the quarters. The main house had 12 rooms, and the cotton fields seemed to go on forever. The organization was as strict as the military. Every person had a specific job. Every day had a strict schedule. Every action was recorded and watched. Martha was sent to the spinning house, a long, low building where a dozen enslaved women turned cotton into thread on spinning wheels. The work was boring but not brutally physical, sitting at the wheel, keeping a steady pace, and making thread of the same thickness. The place was mostly protected from the weather, though it was hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Most importantly, Eleanor Prescott had ordered that mothers with young children could keep them nearby while they worked, as long as the children didn't get in the way of the work. Martha made a corner in the spinning house with blankets for Sarah and Daniel. While she worked at her wheel, Sarah played quietly or slept, and Daniel mostly slept or nursed. The other women in the spinning house slowly got used to Martha, sharing tips on how to manage children while working, and sometimes helping when both babies cried at once. For 3 months, life at Oakwood was stable in a way Martha had never experienced. The work was hard, but not impossible. She was back to household, type work instead of field labor. Her children were with her. The food given was a bit more than at Fairmont: a peck of cornmeal a week, a few pounds of salt pork, and sometimes vegetables from the kitchen garden. Eleonora Prescott made sure everyone rested from work on Sundays, which gave them time to wash clothes, work on the small personal gardens some enslaved people were allowed to have, and go to mandatory prayer services. The prayer services were in a small building near the quarters, led by a white minister from the town nearby, who came every Sunday afternoon to preach to the enslaved group. The sermons were always about being obedient, accepting one's place in life, and the promise of a reward in heaven for suffering on earth. Martha sat through these services with a neutral look on her face, wondering what kind of God would make such a system and call it his will. In late November, everything changed when James Prescott came home from university. James was the youngest of the 3 Prescott sons, 23 years old, and had just finished 2 years of law school at the University of Virginia. He was tall and handsome, with his mother's fine looks and his father's commanding air. He acted with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, who had never thought his wishes might not be granted right away. He had come back to Oakwood full of ideas about how to run the plantation, about modernization and efficiency, and about using new systems he had read about in farming journals. His father let him do as he pleased, allowing James to look at the different operations, fields, barns, processing buildings, and to share his thoughts and suggestions. James noticed Martha in his first week home. She was working at her spinning wheel when he came into the spinning house with his father to inspect the facilities. James watched the women work, asked questions about how much they produced, and looked at the quality of the thread. His eyes stayed on Martha, her clear literacy obvious in how she carried herself, her careful focus on the quality of her work, and her quiet competence. "This one," James said to his father, pointing at Martha, "she can read, you said." Robert confirmed it, and James's interest was clearly sparked. In the next few days, he found reasons to visit the spinning house often, always with questions, always watching Martha work. Within 2 weeks, James had convinced his father to give Martha a new job helping with the plantation's records. The spinning house made large amounts of thread that had to be logged, measured, and tracked. Martha's ability to read and write made her perfect for this job. She was given a desk in the small office connected to the spinning house and told to keep daily production logs, recording the amount and quality of thread each worker made. The new job seemed like a step up. It was slightly less physically demanding, and it was a recognition of her skills, but Martha felt a sense of dread right away. The office was by itself, separate from the main spinning room where the other women worked, and James Prescott found many reasons to spend time in that office. At first, his interest seemed to be truly about the work. He would look at Martha's logs, asking detailed questions about production, having her read parts of farming journals about textile making, and talking about ways to be more efficient. Martha answered carefully, trying to walk the fine line between showing she was capable and not seeming too smart or too independent. But slowly, as expected, James's attention became personal. He started coming to the office late in the afternoon after the other women had gone home. He would sit close to Martha as she explained the log entries, his arm brushing against hers. He started making comments about how she looked, her voice, her intelligence, comments that made Martha's skin crawl, even as she forced herself to accept them without showing any reaction. By Christmas 1842, the act of professional interest was completely gone. James's visits to the office became openly improper. The door was closed, his orders were clear. Martha had no way to fight back, no protection, no chance of refusal. She was property he owned. He was the owner's son. The power dynamic was absolute. She tried to avoid being alone, tried to time her work to leave before his afternoon visits, and tried to bring her children with her as a way to stop him. Nothing worked. James simply ordered her to come back to the office, to leave the children with another woman, and to do what he demanded. By March 1843, Martha realized she was pregnant again, for the third time in less than 3 years. This pregnancy was different from the start. Martha got sick in her 4th month with a fever that went on for weeks. She became too weak to work and had to stay in her cabin, her body fighting to keep both herself and the pregnancy alive while battling an infection. Sarah, now 2 years old, tried to take care of her younger brother, Daniel, by bringing Martha water and patting her face the way she had seen grown-ups do when someone was sick. Eleanora Prescott, whether out of real concern or fear of losing valuable property, had Martha moved to a cabin near the main house where she could be watched more closely. A doctor, Dr. Mitchell from the nearby town, was called. This was a huge expense for an enslaved person, but it was considered necessary to protect the Prescott family's investment. Dr. Mitchell said Martha had severe pneumonia made worse by the pregnancy. He prescribed quinine, bed rest, and healthy food, luxuries rarely given to enslaved people. For 6 weeks, Martha was close to death, her fever rising and falling, her body getting weaker, while Eleanora Prescott strictly managed her care. Slowly, painfully, Martha got better. By June, she was strong enough to sit up, to eat on her own, and to hold her children again. The pregnancy had continued, though Martha had lost a lot of weight and was still weak. In September 1843, after a hard 36-hour labor, Martha gave birth to another daughter. The birth was attended by Dr. Mitchell, another unheard of expense, because her previous sickness had made everyone worry about problems. The baby was born small but healthy, weighing maybe 5'1/2 pounds. The Oakwood birth record noted September 12, 1843, female infant born to Martha, spinning house worker. Difficult birth after mother's severe illness earlier in pregnancy. Child is weak at first but gets better with treatment. Mother and baby both survived labor. Heavy blood loss. Mother needed long recovery. Father unknown. Martha named her daughter Rebecca. She picked the name because it meant to bind or to tie. And Martha felt tied to her children, to this impossible situation, and to survival itself. What happened next followed a pattern that was becoming familiar. Someone, Martha never knew who, but thought it was one of the house servants who had seen James's frequent visits to the spinning house office, told Robert Prescott about his son's involvement. The argument happened late one evening. The whole quarters could hear the shouting from the main house, Robert's voice booming, James's voice defending himself, and Eleanora's voice cutting through both with icy coldness. The argument went on for more than an hour and ended with James leaving Oakwood the next morning. He was sent to run a smaller Prescott property in South Carolina, basically banished from the family's main estate. For 10 weeks after Rebecca's birth, Martha stayed at Oakwood, recovering from the difficult birth and taking care of her 3 children. Sarah was 2.5, starting to talk in full sentences. Daniel was 16 months, just learning to walk. Rebecca was a newborn who needed constant attention. Martha let herself hope, just for a moment, that maybe she would be allowed to stay at Oakwood, that maybe the Prescotts would see her service as valuable enough to ignore her complicated past. Maybe the pattern would finally be broken. Then, on a cold morning in late November, a well-dressed slave trader named Ashworth came to Oakwood. He talked with Robert Prescott for 2 hours, looking at documents and discussing terms. The Oakwood Ledger recorded November 29, 1843. Sale of Martha, age 22, and 3 children, ages 2 years 6 months, 1 year 4 months, and 10 weeks to Ashworth Acquisitions, Charleston. Sale price $650. Reason, rearranging assets due to changing household needs. Money used for estate expansion fund. The price had gone up a little, maybe because of Martha's proven ability to survive, or maybe because 3 children meant potential future labor. But Martha noticed something others might not have. She was still worth less than the $800 she was originally sold for, even though she was in the prime of her working years. Arthur gathered her 3 children, her few belongings, and got ready to leave for the 4th time. As Ashworth's wagon rolled down the oak-lined driveway away from Oakwood, Martha looked back at the plantation that had promised stability but had only given her another version of the same pattern. 3 plantations, 3 pregnancies, 3 sales, and she was still only 22 years old. What Martha didn't fully realize yet was that each sale was making her less valuable. Each child was mocking her as a problem. Each pregnancy was creating a paper trail that would follow her through the books and records of the domestic slave trade. She was being systematically devalued, turned from a high-quality servant into damaged goods, all because of crimes committed against her that she had no power to stop. 2 more plantations were waiting for her. The pattern was not over. Ashworth's territory was a large area from Charleston through Georgia and into Alabama, following the profitable trade routes where cotton was the main crop and enslaved labor was the basis of all wealth. He was a more polished operator than Foster, with better clothes, more connections, and richer clients. He specialized in high-quality stock, enslaved people with skills, training, or other qualities that got premium prices from wealthy planters. Martha's situation was complex. On one hand, her literacy and household skills made her valuable in theory. On the other hand, 3 children under the age of 3 made her less attractive to most buyers, and her history, seen in the trail of sales and transfers on her papers, brought up questions that Ashworth had to handle carefully. The solution was to market Martha as a family unit to a very specific kind of buyer, rich planters who could afford the short-term cost of young children in exchange for long-term labor value, and who prided themselves on their kindness in not breaking up families. Ashworth took Martha and her children to his main facility in Charleston, where they stayed for 3 weeks while he looked for the right buyer. The facility was a large brick building near the slave market, split into cells where enslaved people waited to be sold. Martha and her children were kept in a room with 8 other women and their children, all waiting, all trying not to think about what would happen next. Finally, in mid-December 1843, Ashworth found a buyer, Jonathan Whitfield, the owner of Cedar Hills Plantation in eastern Alabama, one of the richest men in the area. Cedar Hills was the largest property Martha had seen yet, 1,800 acres of prime cotton land, nearly 300 enslaved workers, and a main house that looked like it came from a fairy tale. Jonathan Whitfield had inherited the plantation from his father and made it bigger through smart investments in land and cotton futures. At 54, he was a widower. His wife had died in childbirth 8 years before. He managed his huge operation with careful attention to detail and a strict sense of order. Whitfield had specific needs. He wanted a literate woman to help with household letters and records. He was willing to accept children as part of the deal, as long as they would eventually work on the plantation. Ashworth promised him that Martha was perfect for these needs. The sale was done through letters, with Ashworth taking Martha and her children west to Alabama. The trip took a week, the longest distance Martha had traveled yet, taking her further and further from the Carolinas and Georgia she knew. The Cedar Hills records show December 20th, 1843. Purchase of one female, Martha, age 22, with 3 young children, ages 2 years 6 months, 1 year 5 months, and 11 weeks. Previous owner, Ashworth Acquisitions via Oakwood Plantation, Georgia. Purchase price $600. Skills: literacy, correspondence, household service. Assignment: main house staff. Children to be housed in nursery quarters. Special note: premium paid for literacy skills. Purchase approved by J. Whitfield personally. For the first time in her life, Martha was separated from her children. Cedar Hills was so big that different jobs were kept strictly apart. The main house staff lived in small rooms in a building behind the house. The field workers lived in the quarters a quarter of a mile away, and children too young to work lived in the nursery quarters, a large building looked after by 3 old enslaved women who cared for dozens of children while their parents worked somewhere else on the plantation. Martha was given a small room in the servants' building, just big enough for a small bed and a small trunk, while Sarah, Daniel, and Rebecca were taken to the nursery. She was only allowed to visit them on Sunday afternoons, and being separated was torture. Sarah, now almost 3, didn't understand why her mama couldn't stay with them. She cried every time Martha had to leave, holding onto her skirts, begging her not to go. Daniel, 18 months old, would watch Martha leave with confused eyes, not old enough to understand, but old enough to feel left behind. And Rebecca, just 3 months old, was nursing, which meant Martha had to express milk during the week and take it to the nursery, a painful and humiliating process. Martha's job was in the main house, a world of polish and proper behavior that seemed separate from the harsh reality of the plantation outside. She was in charge of cleaning the second-floor bedrooms, taking care of Jonathan Whitfield's private study, helping with letters when he dictated them, and serving at the table when he had guests. Whitfield himself was a quiet man who rarely spoke directly to his servants except to give orders. He had a large household staff of 12 people who kept the house running with invisible skill, and he demanded perfection. A single speck of dust, a badly folded napkin, or a letter with messy handwriting could lead to harsh punishment, though Whitfield himself rarely gave it. Instead, he had overseers who dealt with discipline, keeping up the idea that he was above such crude things. The work was hard, but Martha found some comfort in how predictable it was. The days had strict routines. The expectations were clear. If she did her work perfectly and made herself invisible, she could live in a kind of numb state, her only goal to survive until Sunday when she could see her children. But Cedar Hills had another person that destroyed any chance of peace. Nathan Whitfield, Jonathan's son. Nathan was 21 years old, the only child left from Jonathan's marriage. He had been raised with every advantage money could buy, and had become a young man who thought the world was there to serve his pleasures. He had been kicked out of university in Virginia for gambling and drinking. He had been sent home in shame, and his father had made him an assistant overseer as a punishment, and supposedly to build his character. Nathan handled his job with all the casual cruelty of someone who had never been told no, and had no feelings for those below him in society. He drank a lot, gambled with the overseers and sons of neighboring planters, and treated the enslaved workers like objects for his amusement or abuse. He noticed Martha within days of her arrival. Martha was carrying clean sheets to the second-floor bedrooms when Nathan came out of his room, clearly having just woken up even though it was mid-afternoon. He watched her work with open interest, making comments about her appearance that made her skin crawl. When she tried to leave quickly, he blocked her way. "You're the new one who can read, aren't you?" he said, his breath smelling of whiskey even though it was early. "Father says you can read and write. How does a slave learn to read?" Martha kept her eyes down. "Yes, sir. I was taught when I was young, sir." "Taught by who? Show me. Read this." He grabbed a book from a nearby table and pushed it at her. Martha read the part he pointed to, her voice calm even though her heart was racing. Nathan laughed. "Well, I'll be damned. You really can read. That's something. Father's got himself a clever one." He let her pass, but his eyes followed her as she left. The attention got worse quickly. Nathan started finding reasons to be wherever Martha was working. He would call her to his room to clean up, even though it had already been done. He would order her to read to him from books or newspapers, sitting too close, touching her as if pointing at the text. The other house servants warned Martha with their eyes and careful silence. This was a familiar situation. They had seen Nathan fixate on women before, had seen what happened when he decided he wanted something. Martha tried every tactic she knew to avoid him, working faster to finish before he showed up, staying in groups with other servants, being so unnoticeable he might forget about her. Nothing worked. Nathan had decided he was interested, and in his world, his interest was the only thing that mattered. By spring 1844, the thing she feared had happened. Martha was pregnant for the 4th time. The exhaustion was overwhelming. 4 pregnancies in less than 4 years. 3 young children she could barely see, constant work, and now another child on the way. Martha felt herself breaking in ways she hadn't let herself feel before. She thought about running. The forests around Cedar Hills were thick, and she had heard quiet stories of people who had escaped and made it to the north. But she had 3 children in the nursery. She couldn't take them with her. They were too young, would slow her down, and would make escape impossible, and she couldn't leave without them. The choice was impossible, so she made no choice. She just kept going, day after day, surviving. By late summer, Martha's pregnancy was clear. Jonathan Whitfield noticed it when she was serving dinner one evening and immediately called the head housekeeper to his study. Within a week, Jonathan had found out about Nathan's involvement. The confrontation was explosive. Servants all over the house heard the shouting, Jonathan's voice like thunder, Nathan's voice defensive and dismissive. The argument ended with Nathan being sent to run a timber business in northern Mississippi, basically exiled from Cedar Hills. But this time, Jonathan Whitfield made a different choice about Martha. Instead of selling her right away, he kept her at Cedar Hills. Maybe he knew that selling her would admit the problem publicly. Maybe he figured she was valuable enough to keep despite the issues. Or maybe he just hadn't seen the pattern that had followed Martha through 4 plantations yet. On November 7th, 1844, Martha gave birth to her 4th child, a son. The birth was difficult. Martha bled heavily, losing so much blood that the midwife worried she would die. The plantation doctor was called, a rare expense for an enslaved woman's childbirth, and he managed to stop the bleeding. But Martha spent 2 weeks in the infirmary recovering. The birth record noted, November 7th, 1844, male infant born to Martha, household staff, difficult delivery, mother lost a lot of blood but survived with medical help. Child healthy, weight approximately 6 pounds 8 oz, father unknown, medical costs $18, charged to Plantation medical account. Martha named her son Joshua, meaning God is salvation, though she felt farther from salvation than ever. While Martha was recovering in the infirmary, Cedar Hills made a decision about her older children. Sarah, now 3½, was considered old enough to start light work. She was moved from the nursery to the main house to be a runner, carrying messages between buildings, bringing water to workers, and learning the basic jobs that would prepare her for house service. Martha found out about this when she finally left the infirmary and saw Sarah working in the kitchen house, her small hands washing vegetables under the watch of the head cook. Sarah's face lit up when she saw her mother, but she wasn't allowed to stop working. They could only look at each other, and Martha had to go on to her own job, her heart breaking. For the next 8 months, Martha lived in a kind of limbo. She worked in the main house, saw Sarah sometimes during work, but couldn't talk to her for more than a few words, and visited Daniel and Rebecca in the nursery on Sundays, now with baby Joshua too. Her body slowly recovered from the difficult birth, though she was weaker than before. The toll of 4 pregnancies and constant work was showing. She waited for the sale she knew was coming, expecting the trader to show up any day. But months went by, and Jonathan Whitfield kept her at Cedar Hills. Martha started to carefully hope that maybe the pattern was broken, that maybe she would be allowed to stay in one place long enough to see her children grow up. Then, in August 1845, a trader named Sheffield arrived at Cedar Hills. Jonathan Whitfield had decided that the problems were more than she was worth, and it was time to cut his losses. The Cedar Hills Ledger recorded August 15th, 1845. Sale of Martha, age 24, with 4 children ages 4 years, 3 months, 3 years, 2 months, 1 year, 9 months, and 9 months. Sold to Sheffield Trading Company, Mobile. Sale price $550. Reason, reducing household staff, reassigning assets. Money applied to estate modernization fund, special notation, medical costs from recent pregnancy of $18 deducted from final asset value. The price kept falling. Martha was now worth less than a third of what she was first bought for, even though she was only 24 and in the theoretical prime of her working life. Her children, instead of making her more valuable, had become burdens in the math of plantation economics. Martha was given 2 hours to get ready. She gathered her 4 children, Sarah, old enough to walk on her own, Daniel, needing to be carried sometimes, Rebecca, toddling but still wobbly, and Joshua, a 9-month-old baby. She wrapped Joshua to her chest in a sling, held Rebecca's hand, and told Sarah to stay close while she tried to manage Daniel. Moving one woman with 4 young children was complicated. Sheffield gave them a wagon with room for everyone, and Martha climbed in with her small, heart-wrenching cargo. 4 children born from violence, carried through suffering, and now being moved again because their existence was proof of crimes that could not be admitted. As the wagon left Cedar Hills, Martha looked back at the plantation that had been her home for 20 months. She saw the white, columned main house. She saw the nursery building where her children had lived away from her. She saw the servants' quarters where she had slept in her tiny room alone while her children cried for her somewhere else on the property. 4 plantations, 4 pregnancies, 4 sales, and somehow, impossibly, Martha was still only 24 years old. One more plantation was waiting for her. The pattern wasn't finished, but Martha was. Sheffield's business was in Mobile, Alabama, a big port city that was a center for the western routes of the domestic slave trade. Enslaved people were moved through Mobile to plantations all over Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana to meet the never-ending demand for labor in the growing cotton and sugar areas. Martha and her 4 children spent 3 weeks in Mobile, kept in a warehouse near the docks. The building was crowded with people waiting to be sold. Men bought for fieldwork, women for house service, children taken from their parents and sold for their future potential. The noise was constant, a mix of crying, praying, and the harsh voices of traders doing their business. Sheffield knew that Martha's situation was a commercial problem. 4 young children made her hard to sell to most buyers. Her falling price history showed she was a problem. But her literacy was still valuable, and some buyers specifically wanted enslaved families that they could show off as being humanely treated to fight back against growing abolitionist complaints. Sheffield found his buyer in Louisiana, Henry de Lacroix, a Creole planter whose family had owned Magnolia Grove for 3 generations. De Lacroix was looking for an educated servant to help with plantation letters and household management, and he was rich enough to handle the cost of supporting 4 young children until they were old enough to work. The sale was arranged through letters, with Sheffield describing Martha as a valuable investment despite her family burdens. De Lacroix agreed to buy her, and in late September 1845, Martha and her children were moved west into Louisiana. The journey was over 200 miles through coastal lands, a type of scenery Martha had never seen before. The land was flat and wet, with bayous and swamps, and thick with Spanish moss hanging from live oak trees. The air smelled of mud and decay, and the particular sweetness of sugarcane. Magnolia Grove was in Louisiana's sugar country, where the farming cycle was different and more dangerous than cotton. Growing sugar needed perfect timing, planting in the spring, tending through the summer, and then the brutal harvest season from October to December, when the whole plantation worked 20-hour days to cut cane and process it before frost could ruin the crop. The grinding season was known as the killing time because of accidents in the mills, deaths from exhaustion, and the terrible pace that pushed workers beyond human limits. The Magnolia Grove records show September 28, 1845. Purchase of one female, Martha, age 24, with 4 children. Ages 4 years, 5 months, 3 years, 4 months, 1 year, 11 months, and 10 months. Previous owner, Sheffield Trading via Cedar Hills Plantation, Alabama. Purchase price, $500. Skills, literacy, correspondence, household management. Assignment, main house, personal attendant to owner. Children to be housed with mother in separate cabin. Special notation, family unit purchase, premium paid for documented literacy skills. Henry Delac, while was 58 years old, a cultured man who had been educated in France and had ties to New Orleans's Creole society. He was a widower who never remarried after his wife died 15 years before. His 3 daughters were all married and lived in New Orleans, leaving him alone at Magnolia Grove with a household staff of 12 enslaved servants and the 200 field workers who kept his sugar business running. Unlike the other plantations, Delacqua gave Martha a small cabin near the main house where she could live with all 4 of her children. It was the first time since Cedar Hills that Martha had been allowed to keep her children with her, and the relief was huge. Sarah, now 4.5, could finally sleep near her mother. Daniel, 3.5, and Rebecca, 2, could play nearby while Martha worked, and Joshua, 10 months old, could nurse whenever he needed to. The cabin was small, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with a dirt floor, 1 window, and a fireplace, but it was theirs. After being separated at Cedar Hills, Martha felt a careful gratitude that she immediately did not trust. Her experience had taught her that anything given could be taken away. Her job was as Delacqua's personal attendant, serving his meals, taking care of his private rooms, managing his letters, organizing his study, and helping when he had guests, which was often, as Delacqua was a social man who had dinners for neighboring planters and New Orleans businessmen. Delacqua was a demanding boss, but not a violent one. He had high standards and expected perfection, but he didn't get angry or hit his servants for small mistakes. Instead, he used a system of small rewards and punishments, a slightly better food ration for good service, taking away Sunday privileges for bad work. It was a quieter form of control than the whip, but it was still control. He was intrigued by Martha's literacy. He would have her read to him while he ate breakfast, parts of French novels, articles from New Orleans newspapers, letters from business partners. He would dictate letters while she wrote them in her neat handwriting, sometimes testing her by using difficult words or French phrases to see if she would stumble. When she sounded out the French words, not understanding them but able to copy the sounds, he seemed amused. "You have a strange mind," he said once, watching her write. "It's a waste, really. In other circumstances, you might have been educated, accomplished. But things are as they are." Martha said nothing. What could she say? The man who owned her body and her children was thinking about how in some other world she might have been treated like a human. The irony was too bitter to speak of. The relationship Delac, while formed with Martha, was different from what she had known at the other plantations. He didn't force himself on her with crude violence. Instead, he created a situation of implied agreement that was just as forceful but more sneaky. He offered small favors, extra food for her children, a better blanket for the cabin, cloth to make new clothes. He presented these as gifts, as proof of his kindness, as rewards for good service. The unsaid meaning was clear: accept these gifts, accept his attention, and life will be easier. Resist, and the gifts will be taken away, the cabin will be taken, the children will be separated and sent to the quarters. It wasn't a choice. It was force disguised as kindness. By early 1846, Martha was pregnant for the 5th time. This pregnancy felt different, not physically, but mentally. Martha saw with complete clarity that she was stuck in a pattern she couldn't escape. 5 plantations, 5 pregnancies, 5 men who had taken what they wanted without any penalty. Her body was not hers, her children were not hers. Even her literacy, the one skill that had seemed like a plus, had become a trap, making her noticeable, making her valuable in ways that only brought pain. She thought about the river that flowed near Magnolia Grove, about walking into it with rocks in her pockets, about escaping through death if no other escape was possible. But then she would look at Sarah, now 5 years old and frighteningly smart, who had learned to read simple words by watching Martha write. She would look at Daniel, 4 years old, who tried so hard to be good, not to cry, not to be a problem. She would look at Rebecca, 2.5, who still smiled through everything. She would look at Joshua, a toddler who didn't yet understand the world he was born into. And Martha would decide to survive one more day. Not for herself. She had stopped caring about her own survival a long time ago, but for them, because if she was gone, who would protect them? Who would secretly teach Sarah to read, give Daniel the hug he so badly needed? Comfort Rebecca when she woke up crying, care for Joshua, so Martha survived and the pregnancy went on, and in September 1846 she gave birth to her 5th child, a daughter. The Magnolia Grove birth record noted, September 3rd, 1846. Female infant born to Martha, personal attendant to H. Delacroix, healthy delivery, no problems, child weight approximately 7 pounds, mother recovered well from delivery, father unknown, special notation, mother